Welcome back, everyone. A couple of months ago, I released a gear packing video. And in that video, while checking out my gear and grabbing a set of tent poles, I said this. I just want to check bungees in the poles. Those feel okay. This tent is an REI tent, and it was pretty cheap. And because of that, I don't have a lot of faith in it, and it's actually already gotten kind of a lot of use. It's been used on a bunch of trips, and at the coast in the saltwater, which is harder on a tent than like normal usage. That prompted a couple of people in the comments to say, do you not trust REI tents? And that's why you checked that. The answer is yes, I trust REI tents. And in fact, I almost exclusively use REI tents. Let's talk about why and what I look for in a tent. Let's go. Okay, welcome back. Good to see you all. This is fun for me. I like tents. I'm fascinated by tents. I've studied tents. I really like tents. I have owned 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6 tents. Let's go through them really quick. My very first tent, purchased in the late 80s, was a Kelty Ridgeway 2-person dome tent. It was $75, bought from Eastern Mountain Sports. And my plan was to use it for a season, and I used it for 3. And it didn't even die at the end of 3. It was just time for me to move up. It had plastic poles, but it was a good little tent. Kelty makes a good little tent, and the Ridgeway is named for Rick Ridgeway, who is a photographer icon, idol of mine, always been. Met him a couple times. Yeah, super cool guy. Okay, that was replaced by the North Face. I don't remember if it was the Big Frog or the Bullfrog. It was the 3-person version frog tent. Purchased in probably 89 or 90. And used forever. I don't know how long. I used it forever. I used it for so long that it finally died. I was pitching it in a campsite, and as I tensioned down and affixed the rainfly, the poles popped through the rainfly just because the nylon had become so degraded from UV over like a decade and change. That tent, man, was great. I did replace the poles at one point, because I bent a pole setting it up in high wind. Yeah, great tent. I think my next tent purchase was then once I started working for REI, I'm pretty sure my next tent purchase was a 4-season tent for the inside passage. But before I bought the REI Mountain 3, which is the 3-person REI mountaineering tent, which does not exist anymore, which was really pretty much a copy of a North Face mountaineering tent. Before I did that, I tried to buy the North Face VE25. Let me rephrase that. I tried to pro deal the North Face VE25, which I had used at Knowles, is the mother of all 4-season tents. I was buying it for Alaska. If you're going to do it, do it. Amazing tent. And twice in the course of a year, the North Face refused my pro deal simply because they don't need to pro deal a tent like that to anyone. They don't make many of them in the course of a year. They don't need to convince anyone to buy it, which is why they pro deal gear to people like me, is so that I can convince people to buy it. Then as an REI employee, I would talk to people about it. Now, as someone with a YouTube channel, I can talk to people about it. If you look into 4-season tents, the VE25 is as good as it gets. And I was fortunate through Knowles to use a bunch of different 4-season tents. The VE25 is the tent. It's big, it's heavy, who cares? I'm a kayaker, right? So I couldn't get that tent. So I was like, you know what? I'm gonna buy the REI 4-season tent. If it's lousy, I'll return it. If it's great, I'll use it. Guess what? It was great. It's a great tent. I used it forever. I finally sold it when we moved out of North Carolina just because I didn't have, by that point I had 3 or 4 tents. I couldn't store them because we were living in the van for a while. So I sold most of my gear at a yard sale. But sort of in that time, I also had a REI Passage 2. No, REI Passage 1. I also had an REI Quarter Dome 3. So a high-end 3-person backpacking tent. And that was for my wife and me and our 2 dogs when we went backpacking or car camping before we had the van. So I've had a bunch of REI tents, and I will tell you unequivocally, REI tents are sensational. They come in at a lower price point than Marmot, Big Agnes, Nemo, but they are solid tents. I've had nothing but good luck with REI tents, and I think they're sensationally made. The reason I said what I did about checking the tent pole bungees was because that tent had been through a couple of seasons of hard use, and I hadn't used it in a while, and that is a great recipe for killing bungee cords. Hey everyone, Brett from the future. I want to talk about one thing I forgot to mention, which is when you're looking at tents, keep in mind that most manufacturers will have tents in different tiers. An entry-level tier, a mid-level tier, a high-level tier. In general, those tents, the tents that I'm talking about, are really backpacking tents. And as you go up in tier, you'll get better materials, better designs, and the weight will come down and the price will go up. So my concern with that tent was that it was not quite the bottom level. REI at the time had 4 levels, so it was 1 up from the bottom. They used cheaper materials. I was worried about the shock cord. Okay, back to me. Bungee cords are easy to replace. I've done a video about them. It was actually my first successful video was during COVID, how to replace tent pole bungee. I'll put a link to that up here someplace. It's not that hard to do. It doesn't need a whole lot of tools. You can totally do it. I would have done it myself, but it didn't need them. But it's something that you should check. It's generally the first thing that goes in a tent that's used a lot. So those are the tents I've used. I've had great experiences. Now, before I talk about the things that I look for that I think are good things to think about when you're buying a tent, are something that you need to understand about the way tents are made. I was fortunate enough when I worked to REI to go out to REI headquarters a couple times. One of those times I got a tour of their design studio and got to meet the people who design tents. Those people know what they're doing. At least they did. I don't know who's there anymore. REI's gotten rid of a lot of people. When you buy a high-end tent, and by high-end I mean the North Face, REI, Big Agnes, Nemo, Marmot, I'm sure there are more that I'm forgetting, but those are what come up in the top of my head. What you're paying for is design. There are only a handful of places in the world that can sew a tent like that. None of the companies I just mentioned are making their production tents in their offices, right? They're designing their tents, they're prototyping them there, they're deciding on materials and pole materials there, then they're contracting out to a company that sews those tents. If you're buying an REI tent, chances are it was sewn in the same factory as a North Face tent and other tent manufacturers as well. Those companies are all in the Far East, China, Vietnam, Thailand, one of those, right? Because that's where those facilities exist. If you're not paying for manufacturing, you're paying for materials and design. And even the materials are pretty similar company to company. So really what it comes down to is you're paying for design. How good is the designer? And I'll tell you another secret. Designers move from company to company. They're very similar items, right? REI tents tend to come in a little bit less expensive, a little bit heavier. As a kayaker, I don't care about weight. Okay, so what do I look for when I'm looking at a tent? They set up a tent in front of you. Is this the tent for me? Here are the things that I'm thinking about. Okay, this is assuming that all high quality tents are seam sealed, which didn't used to be a thing. It used to be, back in the old days, which I am unfortunately old enough to remember, that when you bought even a high quality tent, you then had to go home and seam seal all the stitching. Okay, so 7 things. These are the 7 things that I look for or decisions that I make based on what I'm seeing. And yes, I'm looking at some notes, forgive me. Number 1, the number of people that are using the tent versus the number of people the tent is designed to hold. Tents will have a person count, 2-person, 3-person, 4-person, 6-person. That is not actually counting people. That is counting the number of regular size, so that's 20 inches wide by 72 inches long, regular sized sleeping pads that can fit in there. Now keep in mind, a lot of people don't use regular size pads, so you need to sort of figure out what's going in, what's really going to be used versus what it says. A tent like the Big Agnes Fly Creek 2, which is super lightweight, is a beautiful tent. I love Big Agnes tents. That is the smallest 2-person tent I've ever been in, and I think that that is a great 2-person tent for 1 person. And I have a history of owning 2-person tents that are perfect for 1 person. And I'm just remembering now that I left a tent off of my list of tents. I had a Cirque ASL. Yeesh, the list keeps growing. So figure out what's going to work for you in terms of how big the pads are and how many people are actually going to be in the tent. That's number 1. Think about sizing and stuff like that. So for instance, my friend Johnny, who is 6'2", 6'3", I'm 5'6", 5'7", we both have 2-person tents that work really great for 1 person. He has the Arete ASL from REI. I have I think it's a Trail Dome. They keep changing names on me. It's the same tent. 2 cross poles with a crossbar. Makes the sidewalls more vertical. You want that, but yeah. Okay, number of people. Number 2 on the list, this is super important, a bathtub floor. A bathtub floor curls up so that the seams joining the wall of the tent and the floor of the tent are not at ground level. That seam is usually about 4 inches above the ground, so you have fewer seams in contact with running water in really bad weather. And I really like bathtub floors for that reason. I tend to be in wet environments and I want that seam up higher. Also, back in the day, you used to be able to buy a tent that would not have a seam running across the floor. Those are pretty rare now. I'm sure it dramatically raises the price of manufacturing, but there really should only be 1 seam running across the floor, and that's the only place where water could get in. So bathtub floor, super important for me. Full coverage rain fly is number 3. I will not buy a tent that does not have a full coverage rain fly, which will prevent water from blowing into the tent on a really windy day. It can impede airflow, so you need to be aware of that. But I won't buy a vent that does not have a full coverage rain fly. Part 2 of that, which is item 4, is ventilation. How big is the ventilation in the top of the tent? And how far apart is the point where the mesh starts on the tent wall and the rain fly stops? Right? So if this is solid tent wall and this is mesh, how much does the wind have to do this to get under the rain fly and into the tent? You want air moving through your tent because it decreases condensation. So I think a lot about ventilation. How big are the vents? Where are the vents? Where is that line between rain fly and tent wall? You want good airflow. Number 5, no plastic, no fiberglass in the tent poles. I'm okay with plastic clips. Plastic clips don't break. They don't get torqued in any way that they would break. However, tent poles get tweaked and bent, and they've got to at least be aluminum. I've never owned a tent with carbon poles, so I can't speak to how good and flexy they are, but there are lots of great aluminum tent poles that work beautifully. So no fiberglass, no plastic in tent poles. Sit into is better than crawl into. And what I mean is, so like my friend Johnny's tent, the door is on the front, versus my tent, the door is on the side. He has to crawl into his tent. I can just sit down into my tent. I find sitting down way easier, and crawling as bodies age gets harder and harder. I think he's still got a great tent. I think he overlooked that because he was getting some other things that he preferred and would deal with that crawl in. I bought a much cheaper tent than he did. I think that Arete ASL is a great tent. And if I were going back to Alaska and needed a tent, that tent would be high on my list. So I prefer to sit down into the tent. I find it easier to deal with than crawling into the tent. My big frog or bullfrog, whichever it was a crawl in, and it got tired. Finally, this is a big one. How do the door zippers work to get into and out of the tent? I'm not talking about like who makes the zipper or anything like that. Most zippers are made by YKK, which is great. How many zipper pulls do you have to do to get out of the tent? When it's 3 in the morning and I gotta leave the tent to go to the bathroom, is it one big round zip and maybe a rain fly? Is it 2 zipper doors and then a rain fly? That, for me, like, I want one big zip is my goal. But a lot of great tents, I'm thinking about the big Agnes Copper Spur, is still to open the door, you've got to open a bottom zipper and a top zipper. That's a great tent. If I buy that tent, I'll overlook that, but that is something that I think about, right? So think about how doors open and things like that. And also think about, how does the rain fly door open? Will it stay open? Does it need to be tied back? How does that work? And something I neglected to mention when I was talking about full coverage rain flies was that full coverage rain fly should give you at least one full-sized vestibule where you can put your boots and your backpack or whatever, your gear, and it's protected from the elements. A 2-person tent should have 2 doors and 2 vestibules so that you don't have to climb over someone to get out. Sorry, skip that one. That's what happens when I work from notes. That's sort of my tent history, my tent pedigree, and what I look for when I'm shopping for a tent that you can use as a guideline when you are shopping for a tent. Okay, that's all I've got for today. If you like this, do me a favor, hit like, hit subscribe. My books are on Coffee. My gear list is on Coffee. All that stuff is on Coffee, or you can just buy me a coffee. All right, I'll see you outside. Lisa uses a fancy pillow.
Well, I got this. This is a swag. Well, might as well try it, right?
Because outdoor educators don't make any money, but people give us gear.